I drove for hours, watching the dark highway stretch endlessly ahead of me. My headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the road. The late-night drive from New York to North Carolina was something I'd been mentally preparing for weeks. I had 2 job interviews, each promising new opportunities that I couldn't afford to miss. I was running on fumes, both emotionally and physically. A full 8-hour drive loomed before me, and I was exhausted beyond belief. The clock had just ticked past midnight. I had been on the road for almost 5 hours, having taken off from work just as soon as the last meeting ended. I wasn't the type to spend a lot of money, so I opted to drive instead of flying. Cheaper, and I could always stop and get a good meal along the way. But the longer I drove, the more the realization set in. This wasn't going to be easy. I had enough coffee to fill a small lake, but the fatigue was creeping in. My body begged for sleep, but I knew I couldn't afford to stop yet. The highway was practically empty. The occasional car would pass me, but for the most part, I had the road all to myself. I told myself I could do this. Just a few more hours. Suddenly, something caught my eye. A man, a figure standing on the side of the road. The sight of him sent a shiver through my spine. I glanced at him as I drove past. Just a man, standing perfectly still, wearing a suit. He was looking directly at my car. I didn't know why it unnerved me so much, but something about it felt wrong. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, it was late, and I hadn't slept much. But I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. I even found myself wondering how he ended up there, standing alone in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't long before I saw another one. Another man, another suit. This one was further down the road, but the eerie stillness of his posture, just standing there, staring at me, was the same as the first. What the hell? I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. Was there some kind of event happening? But no, there was nothing. Just more darkness, more fog, and more empty highway. I contemplated pulling over to check if they needed help, but I quickly dismissed the thought. I didn't know what they were doing there, but I certainly wasn't about to find out. The drive dragged on, my exhaustion mounting. I was beginning to lose track of time, barely able to keep my eyes open. As I passed a small rest stop, I decided to pull in for a quick break. I needed coffee. Badly. I parked in the lot and grabbed a medium-sized cup, the warm liquid filling me with the temporary illusion of energy. I stepped outside to stretch my legs, rubbing my tired eyes. It was only then that I saw him again. The man in the suit, standing beneath a lamppost, staring. I froze, my blood running cold. He wasn't moving. His face was neutral, emotionless, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I knew I should have driven away, but something in my gut told me to stay. I wanted to go up to him, to ask if he was okay, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not this time. My mind raced with questions, all of which led to more confusion. I climbed back into my car, heart pounding. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. As I pulled out of the lot and merged back onto the highway, I felt my tiredness return with a vengeance. I still had an hour and a half to go, and all I wanted to do was find a bed and sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the suit. It was becoming an obsession. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing behind me, following me. But he was always just out of sight. And then my car sputtered. The engine coughed and stalled, and the dashboard flashed an error. Panic surged through me as I tried to restart it. Nothing. Just a dying engine. Great, I muttered. The last thing I needed was car trouble this late at night, in the middle of nowhere. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called roadside assistance. I was about to start looking up the nearest mechanic when I heard something that made my stomach drop. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching my car. I peered out the window, but there was no one in sight. I shook my head. It must have been my mind again, trying to scare me. But then the footsteps came again. Closer this time. A figure appeared in the periphery, just barely visible in the dark. The outline of a man. A tall, thin figure dressed in a suit. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. The man from the highway. The one I had seen earlier. How was he here? How had he followed me? Before I could react, he was at my window. I felt the blood drain from my face as he knocked lightly on the glass. I cracked it just a bit, my voice barely a whisper. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I noticed you're having trouble. Need a hand?" I didn't trust him. Something felt deeply wrong. I quickly rolled the window back up, the sound of the mechanism echoing in the silence. The man didn't move, just stood there, watching me. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he walked away. I didn't wait to see what he did next. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, heart hammering in my chest. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the empty highway. The man was gone. I drove for miles, the night stretching endlessly before me. A few hours later, I found a gas station and decided to pull over for another break. I needed more coffee, but when I walked into the station, I froze. Standing at the counter was the same man, the man in the suit. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was in the store, buying something. His face was still neutral, emotionless. His presence, unnerving. I could feel my heart pounding, my throat tightening. He was everywhere, and somehow, it felt like he was following me. I turned and walked back to my car, my hands trembling. I couldn't explain it, but the sensation that something was wrong deepened. The tension in the air was suffocating, like the entire world had gone quiet, holding its breath. I got back into my car and pulled away, trying to push the thoughts of the man out of my mind. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror one more time, I saw him standing by the entrance to the gas station, watching me leave. His eyes locked with mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. It was a hallucination, I told myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. I was just tired, but the chill that crept up my spine told me otherwise. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the exhaustion. I decided to pull into a nearby parking lot to rest. The last thing I wanted was to drive myself into a ditch because of my fatigue. I angled my seat back, trying to settle in for a few hours of sleep. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a tap on my window. A scream ripped from my throat as I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing outside my car, was the man in the suit. Again. This time, he was so close I could almost feel the cold of his presence seeping through the glass. I don't know how, but I managed to start the car. I sped off, never once looking back. Story 2. I had just gotten off work, another late-night shift at the diner, and I was exhausted. It was a Friday, and my shift ended just past midnight, the slowest time for business. It had been a long week, and I couldn't wait to get home and put my feet up. I lived alone, in a small apartment just on the outskirts of Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. It was a quiet town, small enough that everyone knew each other. The kind of place where the only sound after hours was the rustling of trees and the occasional passing car. Normally, I'd take the highway home, a quick route that cut through the backwoods of the county. But tonight, I decided to avoid the usual heavy traffic and instead take a small, winding road that would lead me to a secluded stretch of highway. There, I could drive for miles without seeing a single car. It was peaceful, and I loved the calm, the silence. I didn't think twice about it when I pulled onto that stretch of road, my headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to settle in as the night grew deeper. The radio hummed softly in the background, my usual podcast keeping me company as the miles passed by. It was a long, lonely drive, but I didn't mind. It was the only time I had to myself all week, and I cherished the solitude. The car's fuel light flickered on about 15 minutes into the drive. I sighed, knowing I'd need to stop for gas soon. There wasn't much in the way of convenience on this road. It was mostly just dark woods and the occasional rundown shack. But about 5 minutes later, I spotted a small, no-name gas station on the side of the road. It was the only building in sight for miles. I pulled into the lot, relieved to have found somewhere to stop. The station was empty except for a single old pickup truck parked next to the pump. The place had the look of a forgotten outpost, the kind you would pass without a second thought if you weren't desperate for fuel. I didn't give it much thought as I stepped out of the car and walked into the small, dingy shop. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I approached the counter, where a tired-looking man stood, his eyes fixed on the register. I noticed the older pickup truck parked outside, but that was the only vehicle in the lot. No sign of any other customers. It wasn't unusual for places like this to be deserted in the dead of night, especially on a road like this. I grabbed a coffee, paid for my gas, and went back outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face as I approached my car. I couldn't help but notice the man filling up the truck at the pump. He looked over at me, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk, so I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled away. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the silence of the road returned. But something felt off. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe the isolation, maybe the strange, lingering glance the man had given me as I left. It could have been nothing, but my mind started to play tricks on me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pickup truck following me, but there was nothing. As I continued driving, the miles seemed to tick by slower and slower. My thoughts began to wander, and I focused on nothing but the road in front of me. Suddenly, a loud ding came from the dashboard, and the screen flashed that my rear tire was low. Great, just what I needed. I had only a few more miles to go before I reached the highway, so I figured I'd keep going and deal with it when I got home. The car wobbled slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a flat tire. I cursed under my breath and pulled to the side of the road, the fog thickening around me. The area was completely deserted, and the moon barely broke through the mist. The sound of the wind howling in the trees was the only noise I could hear. I got out of the car, the cold biting at my skin as I inspected the flat. Sure enough, the rear driver's side tire was completely deflated. I had no idea how it had happened. I didn't think I had hit anything. My first thought was that someone had slashed it, but who would do that out here, in the middle of nowhere? I reached into the trunk to grab my emergency kit, pulling out a flashlight. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the fog as I tried to assess the situation. But that's when I heard it. The sound of an engine. A truck, idling somewhere in the distance. I paused, squinting into the dark, trying to locate the source. It was eerie how quiet everything else was. No other cars had passed for miles. The truck's engine roared to life, and I saw headlights cutting through the fog in the distance. The truck was coming towards me. I froze, my heart racing. Was it the man from the gas station? Was he coming to help? Or was something else going on? The headlights grew brighter as the truck pulled closer, but there was something strange about the way it moved. No signals, no sound of a turning wheel. It was as if the truck was just gliding silently along the road. Then, it stopped about 200 feet away from me, its headlights cutting through the fog, illuminating the trees. I stood there, motionless, watching. The truck didn't move, didn't inch forward or back. It just sat there, idling. I had a bad feeling. Something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way the truck had appeared out of nowhere, or the way it sat perfectly still, but I knew I wasn't about to approach it. I ducked behind a nearby tree and pulled my phone out, dialing 911. My hands were shaking as I whispered into the phone, telling the dispatcher about the flat tire and the truck that had just appeared. She asked the usual questions. What did the driver look like? What kind of truck was it? Was I in danger? I told her I didn't know, but I didn't feel safe. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and wait, but just as I was about to answer, the truck's engine roared again, and the headlights blinked on and off. It was like the truck was signaling something. I felt a surge of panic. As the dispatcher kept talking, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. The man from the gas station was now walking toward the truck. He moved with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. I could see the outline of him in the fog, his features obscured by the distance, but he didn't seem to notice me hiding behind the tree. I held my breath, my hand still gripping the phone, watching as the man approached the truck. He was talking to the driver, but I couldn't hear the words. I could tell the situation wasn't normal. Something was wrong, and I had to get out of there. I wasn't thinking clearly, but my survival instincts kicked in. I darted out of the woods and into the road, running as fast as I could. My shoes slipped on the wet ground, but I kept moving, adrenaline flooding my system. I didn't look back, just focused on the road ahead. The truck's headlights flickered on again, and I heard the engine rev. The sound of tires screeching filled the air as the truck sped off, tearing down the road in the opposite direction. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, my body shaking from the fear. My phone buzzed in my hand. 911 had dropped the call. I was alone again, but not for long. The man in the truck was gone. The man from the gas station was nowhere in sight. And yet, the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach still wouldn't go away. There were no more cars, no more sounds. Just me, standing in the middle of an empty road, watching the fog swallow everything around me. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was all just coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. But what I do know is that the next morning, when I passed the gas station on my way home, the old pickup truck was gone. No sign of it anywhere. Story 3. It was the winter break, and I was finally heading to visit Todd. After weeks of back and forth travel, we decided it would be easier if I just made the trip up to his place this time. He lived a few hours north of me, and while I didn't mind the drive, it was starting to snow harder the further I went. By the time I was nearing the halfway point, the snowstorm warnings were coming in thick and fast. I should have stopped to wait it out at some point, but stubbornness and a sense of urgency pushed me forward. I'd been planning this trip for a while, and I wasn't about to turn back. I drove my older Hyundai Sonata, A car I wasn't exactly thrilled about driving in snow, but it had gotten me through several rough winter trips before. As the snow began to pile up on the road, my confidence in the vehicle started to waver. The car wasn't built for these conditions, but it was all I had. I stopped at a small diner along the way. The place looked old and a little run down, but it was a perfect little stop to grab a sandwich and a cup of coffee. I had no idea how bad the weather would get, but at least I could gather myself for a bit before heading back out. The diner was quiet, the only other person inside a man sitting at the bar with a beer. He seemed out of place. Most people came in for food and left quickly, but this guy seemed to be just hanging out, nursing his drink. The waitress behind the counter was friendly, but there was an edge to her, like she'd seen too many tired travelers come and go. She recommended a couple of motels in the area, warning me about the snowstorm and the roads. After a few minutes, the man at the bar spun around on his stool and asked if I was headed north. When I nodded, he gave me a weird, almost too eager look and mentioned a motel just a few minutes up the road. "Nice and cheap," he said. "You'll be able to get some rest before heading back out in the morning. You don't want to drive through a storm like this without a good sleep." I thanked him for the advice, but something about the way he said it made me pause. Was he just being friendly, or was there something more to it? Still, I didn't think much of it. I was tired and just wanted to find a place to crash for the night. After paying for my meal, I drove the few miles to the motel he'd recommended. When I pulled into the parking lot, the first thing that struck me was how deserted it was. The snow was falling heavily now, covering everything in a blanket of white. The motel was small and looked like it had seen better days, but it had the kind of charm that only an old roadside motel could have. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, and that was all I needed for the night. I went inside and rented a room. The man at the front desk gave me a key and told me to take the first room on the left. It was an old building, with thin walls and the faint smell of stale air hanging in the hallway. I didn't think much of it. At that hour, most people would be huddled inside, away from the storm, so it was strange that there were no other cars in the parking lot, no other lights on in the rooms. The room itself was small but functional. A queen-size bed sat against the far wall. Its old red carpet matched the faded wallpaper, and there was a small bathroom off to the side. I set my bag down and made a quick call to Todd, telling him I was finally settling in. The connection was awful, but we managed to chat for a bit before the call dropped. I decided to take a shower, hoping to warm up before bed. But when I came out, I noticed something odd. The bathroom door was shut, but I could have sworn I left it open when I went in. Maybe I had closed it without realizing it, but the thought didn't sit right with me. I shrugged it off, though, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks. Then, when I went to check my phone for messages, I noticed something else. A set of footprints leading from the freshly fallen snow outside to the door of my motel room. The steps were small, like someone had walked from the parking lot to the room just moments before I arrived. It was a strange detail, but I convinced myself it was nothing. I turned to look out the window, my mind still wrestling with the odd feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was a new car in the parking lot now, a dark sedan that hadn't been there before. I couldn't see who was inside, but the car sat there with its engine running. Just the sight of it made my skin crawl. I didn't know why. I told myself it was all in my head and went back to my phone. I was texting Todd when I heard a noise, something small, like a tap on the door. My heart skipped a beat as I turned, half expecting the man from the diner to be standing there. But when I looked through the peephole, there was nothing. No one. The thought that someone might have been outside for that brief moment made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing. The storm was likely playing tricks on my mind. Maybe I had been hearing the wind. After a couple of minutes, I turned off the lights and settled into bed. The warmth of the blankets felt comforting, and I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of someone knocking. I froze. My pulse raced as I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know who it could be. No one had any reason to knock on my door, especially not in the middle of the night. I peered through the peephole again, but the hallway outside was empty. What the hell was going on? I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept racing. I texted Todd again, telling him what was happening. His response was a string of worried messages. Don't open the door. Call the front desk or the police. But as I sat there, contemplating what to do next, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the small window next to the door, I saw the shadow of a figure standing outside. The figure wasn't moving. It was as if they were just waiting for me to do something. Or maybe they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't want to panic, but every instinct in me screamed to get out of there. I stood frozen for a moment, then slowly backed away from the door, grabbing my phone and my shoes. I needed to get out, but before I could make my move, the door handle rattled. I held my breath. The door shook again, this time more forcefully, as if someone was trying to break in. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I had no way of knowing who was out there, and I certainly wasn't going to open the door to find out. I called the front desk, but the phone just rang and rang. No answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do next. Just as I was about to bolt for the door, I heard something behind me, footsteps in the hallway. I whirled around and caught a glimpse of someone moving outside my room. I could barely make out the figure, but it looked like the man from the diner. He was walking slowly, almost casually, like he didn't have a care in the world. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. The man from the diner, the one who had recommended the motel, was now outside my room. I tried to steady my breathing, but my hands were trembling. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, I froze. The man wasn't alone. Another figure stepped into view, a large man, towering over the first. The two of them were talking in low voices, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. I didn't wait around to find out. I bolted for the window, throwing open the blinds. There was no way I could stay there, not with them outside my door. I climbed through the window, into the freezing snow, and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the diner, my breath was coming in ragged gasps, and the snow had started to fall even harder. I tried to collect myself before going inside, but my hands were still shaking from the fear. The diner was empty, save for the waitress, who gave me a concerned look when I walked in. I asked if I could use her phone, and when I spoke with Todd, my voice was hoarse. I explained everything, the man from the diner, the strange figures outside my room, the fear that had nearly paralyzed me. But the most unsettling part was yet to come. The waitress told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Oh, honey, that motel? It's been closed for years. I don't know how you got a room there." My blood ran cold.